Thank you so much, Amal, for coming here and being so generous with your time and for a really interesting talk. I wanted to sort of first touch on, you mentioned how the different forms of sort of discrimination that Muslims can experience in their life. One thing which is sort of quite prevalent in the UK currently is the government's refugee policy and the Home Secretary wanting to send refugees to detention camps in Rwanda. How do you feel, having also seen in this country and others, the sort of reaction to the ability to take on Ukrainian refugees, and yet the sort of dichotomy between that and the response to many Muslim refugees from countries whose wars have been started by the West? Do you believe that that's one of the manifestations of Islamophobia?
Absolutely, and in many ways, Islamophobia is a branch of xenophobia, and it's only further complicated by the ideological suspicion towards Muslim refugees. But I live in the United States, where we have migrants that are coming from our southern border, from Honduras, from Guatemala, from El Salvador, that are treated awfully at the border and have been treated awfully under Democratic and Republican administrations. And there is a lack of recognition about the role that we have played as the United States in destabilizing those countries and causing those migrant crises that we now have to grapple with at the border. I think that I often would say to them that the United States would not be able to handle the same refugee crisis from the northern border if there were a bunch of Canadians at the northern border being treated as atrociously as those people from South America are treated at the southern border. I don't think that the American mind would be able to grapple with that in the same way that we would be able to live with ourselves. I think our conscience would be more disturbed, as we should be disturbed when we see any human being treated in the ways that refugees are treated around the world. The refugee population has doubled over the last decade, and it's only expected to get worse. And so we can continue to shore up the security of our borders and to have stronger refugee policies and deport people from nation to nation. But eventually that's an unsustainable construct. And so I think that what we're seeing happening, not just here in the United Kingdom with some of the rhetoric of sending refugees back home, which is a very popular way to shore up cheap political support, we're not just seeing that in the Western world, we're even seeing that in Muslim countries as well. People use that to campaign. People use that to shore up popular support. The refugee is a very easy scapegoat. And it's important for us to collectively take a step back and reassess the way that we have dehumanized the refugee and turned the refugee into a source of fear rather than a source of inspiration. Turn the refugee into the other instead of our potential selves. Having been to many refugee camps around the world, I can tell you that you immediately notice the difference between populations that have been refugees for decades and those that have only recently turned into refugee populations. And as you sit with a refugee, a Syrian refugee, for example, and we often forget how new that catastrophe is, you'll hear them talk about how I used to have a clinic in Damascus. I used to have a home in Damascus. I used to do this. I used to do that. I used to own this. I used to live in dignity. I wasn't always this way. And they don't understand why they have become such a source of fear and anxiety for others. So I think that we have to take a step back and we have to challenge ourselves. And this is something that cannot be achieved merely through political rhetoric or merely through playing the numbers game and trying to make it a feasible option. This is something that requires a deep interrogation of society and self, a deep interrogation of ethics and principles, and a shared humility and recognition that you may also be a refugee one day. And one of the things that we should have all recognized in the wake of pandemics and earthquakes and the global economic degradation, as I've spoken about, is that populations that are one day in prosperity, within a matter of minutes, find themselves in abject poverty and adversity. and trying to rebuild and find a new home. So we have to solve beyond the nation-state construct and deeply interrogate ourselves and our societies.
Absolutely. One of the biggest refugee problems, which you also touched on, is the occupation of Palestinian people's homes. Do you believe, you've been quite critical of the Abraham Accords in the past, do you believe that that treaty is a way of sort of selling out the Palestinians by states that have previously been supportive or from the Muslim world?
I mean, I can't appreciate how the name of Abraham is being used to ratify arms deals and make apartheid okay all of a sudden. It is an insult to the name of Abraham. It's an insult to the Palestinian people who have only been further marginalized through these accords. The Palestinian people have been erased to the point that they don't even get to negotiate terms on behalf of themselves. They have only been further disenfranchised through these accords. And I think that it's important to ask ourselves, why is it that even when Palestinian welfare is spoken about in the context of the broader picture, it's always in the capacity of ensuring Israel's security. It's always in the capacity of ensuring a stable Middle East, as if Palestinian human dignity and Palestinian life has no worth of its own, as if they don't have an equal right to dignity as any other human being in the Middle East. And one of the things that I find very troubling is that the Palestinian people are looked at as a burden now. You're a burden to our politics, you're a burden to our ability to find mobility. You'll find often that politicians in the West that would have previously been pro-Palestinian slowly start to move away from that in the name of that mobility. We're too expensive of a cause for domestic politicians and for even, unfortunately, global Muslim superpowers. So it's important for us to ask ourselves, where is the Palestinian voice? And to actually acknowledge that we're at a point now in this occupation where media buildings could be blown up, where respected journalists could be shot dead in broad daylight, and the literal silencing of the Palestinian voice goes without consequence. And so I feel like those who have a voice have a responsibility to amplify the Palestinian voice, because it is systematically being removed from the discourse, both by existing, quote unquote, peace talks that have not yielded any sort of justice for the Palestinian people, as well as these accords that are done in their name, but without their seat at the table.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And moving on to, you talked about the sort of mischaracterizations of Muslims. As I'm a history student, and one of my favorite courses I've done is on the rise of Islam. And I think I just wanted to sort of ask, to what extent do you think that sort of the writings of history have played a role in that mischaracterization? For instance, the golden age of Islam is frequently considered the dark age in Europe, ignoring, as you said in your talk, the sort of huge cultural advancements which weren't limited to Islam, but were truly multicultural endeavors. Do you think that sort of actually that historical perspective is at the root of this mischaracterization?
Absolutely. One of the things that Malcolm X said when speaking about the colonization of Africa, and then the interrogation of Africa for its present state, he said, you clip the bird's wing and then blame it for not flying as high as you. So I think that it's important for us to equally interrogate, again, our role in the Muslim world, as well as our portrayal of Islamic history, which has allowed for that constant relationship of ongoing imperialism to be present. Reading history, you have a deep appreciation for not just how Islam was able to contribute and enrich cultures that it interacted with, but Islam was indeed able to protect other communities. You find historic religious communities that existed in the Muslim world. Where are they in Europe, right? That have existed in the Muslim world now for over 1,000 years. Those religious communities, those cultures that were not suffocated, but only enriched by the presence of Islam, I think bear witness to the best of what our ethics are. Now, have Muslims fallen short, past and present, of their own ethical claims? Absolutely. There's no doubt about it. And as I said in my talk, it's important for us as Muslims to try to live up to those ethics constantly and to try to live by that example that we find, that prophetic example that we find that was lived through those great people that we celebrate as well, and those great legacies that form the basis of the Islamic Golden Age. But yes, we have to look at the entire context of how Islam came into relationship with culture and how Islam allowed for peoples and cultures to be enriched by its presence. And of course, speaking of Palestine, studying the legacy of Salah ad-Din becomes that much more important. This, the treatment of Salah ad-Din to those who were at his mercy once he entered into Jerusalem versus the way that the Crusaders dealt with the Muslim world in the name of Christ. It's important for us to look at that entire history and to bring it out in the most honest fashion, and then to look at the very ways that it continues to shape our discourse and our policies today.
As you say, one of the reasons for the very quick spread of Islam was the plurality and the openness that other people of the book experienced. But is there, your talks on whether Islam's a test, not a threat, given that all religions have sort of unique fundamental truth claims, is there a part of any kind of religious tension that is going to lead to a perception of threat? For instance, with the Umayyads and Abd al-Malik building the Dome of the Rock, one of the inscriptions was, "Jesus is not the Son of God." Where do you sit on that? Do you think that those sort of differences can be overcome, or in incredibly when religiosity is very high, is there going to be a sort of inevitable tension and therefore vilification?
Well, I think that what I would do is question, in the absence of religion, are tensions any less? Do wars suddenly stop? Do catastrophes stop happening? And I think that the 20th century is a testimony to the tragedies that take place in the name of secular ideologies. There has been more death and destruction in the 20th century than any century prior, and none of those isms were religious isms. And so it's important for us to recognize that human behavior is human behavior, and the use of that which is holy for unholy pursuits is going to happen. However, I think that at the core of Islam, instead of going back and deliberating every single past religious conflict and every time that an Islamic empire acted in a certain way, at the core of Islam is this idea that there is no compulsion in religion, truth stands clear from falsehood, and that there is a faith in the ideals themselves, speaking for themselves, in the truth itself, speaking for itself, and that we should be able to have those conversations at a level to where we can passionately argue for our truth, but not make your embracing of that truth a condition for me treating you humanely as a neighbor, and in fact seeing my treatment of you as part of my own religious pursuit of God's pleasure. And so it's important to look at, not just what would happen if people become more religious, but to look at what has happened as people have gone away from religion and what that has resulted in terms of human catastrophe.
And you sort of spoke about how you're very aware of, just like any sort of truth, obviously the human falls short of the perfect form. How do you suggest going about times whereby perhaps states use certain perceptions or interpretations of Islam, perhaps Wahhabism, in order to promote despotism and autocracy, as many of you sort of accuse of Saudi Arabia, for instance? How do you think, if we should in fact confront this, what are the ways to do it in a way which does not engage in Islamophobia or an unnecessary and unfair vilification of Islam itself? How does one remain true to the religion whilst also able to confront certain interpretations?
I think one of the problems that we have is that when you say, what about the Muslim world? Which Muslim world are you talking about, right? Are you talking about the Gambia? Are you talking about Malaysia? Are you talking about Saudi Arabia? Are you talking about Afghanistan? Or which part of the Muslim world are you talking about? Because what often happens is that the regional is ignored and the religion or the religious is looked at, whereas you'll find that most of the times, right, people operate in a certain way based upon their regions, not their religious values, their claims to religious values. And then what ends up happening to the Muslim community is that you take states that, represent perhaps a tiny percentage of the overall Muslim population. And then you question the entire Muslim population about that particular state's usage of this text. And somehow we all become responsible for that. So the conversation becomes, if one country carries out a particular practice or bases a policy on a particular religious interpretation, is the entire Muslim world now to answer for the policies of that country? And so what I would say is that, how do we engage in these conversations without it becoming Islamophobic? Muslims have their texts to go back to, their traditions to lean back on, to debate interpretations and practices as they exist and as they unfold today. But it's just not fair to say, well, this state does this. I mean, it's just like, I can remember not too long ago being asked, why does Saudi Arabia not allow women to drive cars? I was like, you know what? By the way, that question no longer exists. I don't get asked that question anymore. I'm like, ask someone from Saudi Arabia or someone that was a part of crafting that policy. But if you're asking me as a Muslim scholar, do I find religious justification or a ruling that we should somehow apply this to Muslim women all over the world, the answer is no. But if you want to talk about Saudi's policies, you should talk to someone from Saudi Arabia and examine Saudi policy in that light. The last thing I'll say in this regard is that, many times the sudden care for the rights of a country, the rights of a people that live in a particular Muslim country, happen to magically align with our interests in that region. And the head of that state not willing to operate with the interests that we have declared fundamental to our foreign policy here in the West. And so we're never really concerned with a dictator's preserving the rights of their own people. But suddenly, when there is a benefit to destabilization, we start to critique the treatment of minorities in that country, and we start to talk about what's happening here and what's happening there. And we have all this interest in securing the rights of people in that region. And so there's been a dishonesty in the way that the Middle East in particular has been dealt with that has this Islamophobic undertone, because it's conveniently resorted to only when there is, again, a colonial interest at play.
All right. Well, I'm very aware that there's lots of people who probably want to ask questions, so I'll open it up to questions from the floor. A lot gone up. Yes, to the member just there, for third row back on the aisle.
Thank you very much. My name is Fatma, and I'm from Afghanistan. I see that majority of people in the chamber are women, while millions of women in Afghanistan are banned from receiving an education by the Taliban. Unfortunately, in the past 1.5 years, almost 2 years, we haven't seen any statement coming from prominent Muslim scholars denouncing the action, what the Taliban are doing in Afghanistan, not only to women, but to the entire country. So even today, in the past 1 hour, I was waiting to hear something from you talking about how a group who are not probably Muslims are using the name of Islam to ban women from receiving an education or terrorizing an entire nation. But unfortunately, I didn't hear anything. And I am disappointed that when prominent Muslim scholars have a platform, they never discuss this as well. And I believe that this also inevitably impact how Muslims and Islam is viewed around the world and by other people. So I just wanted to hear your opinion on that, and I would appreciate it if prominent Muslim scholars talk about what the Taliban are doing in Afghanistan under the name of Islam, and talk about it more. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. And what I would say is that perhaps you may be unfamiliar with the statement that was signed by numerous Muslim scholars on women's imperative for education in Afghanistan by Muslim scholars around the world, and I was proud to be a signatory of that statement. And I absolutely do believe in women's right to education, and there has been, I think, an effort for many Muslim scholars to exert pressure to say that this is a right and this is important for Muslim women to have access to that, while pushing back on the Western approach of starving the people of Afghanistan in the name of women's rights. I believe in holding all people accountable proportionately. And so I am fundamentally opposed to the starvation of Afghanistan and the way that the people of Afghanistan have been dealt with and ravaged by the outside. And I'm fundamentally opposed to the denial of women from education. And this is precisely, I think, one of the ways in which I would say that one country becomes representative of the global Muslim population. There's only one Muslim country in the world that has such a policy, and it's Afghanistan. So clearly the problem is not the Muslim and the Islam part. However, again, I think that Muslim scholars obviously should raise their voice when they see injustice anywhere as they see it, and they should apply pressure properly. And I was proud to sign on to that statement, and I reiterate my support, as have Muslim scholars that I know from around the world, from various schools of thought, from neighboring Pakistan all the way to the United States of America, that have called upon the Taliban to reopen those schools and to allow women access to education. Thank you.
Yes, to the member.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam.
I just had a question which went back to your speech, which was that you spoke about Islam and the West as if they were civilizations that were sort of from two different poles, and I just wondered your thoughts about this idea that there is now an Islamic West, there's now like a civilization that's built its own identity. And I also just wanted to make a cheeky dua request because I had a loved one that really wanted to be here, but they can't for external reasons. And I just ask you and everyone here to please make dua that their difficulties are solved. Yeah, Jazakallah khair.
Thank you for your question, and you all can clap for it, it's okay. If I was able to make out, I had a difficulty hearing the entire question, but the idea of what do we do now about a Muslim Western identity, an Islamic Western identity, and not speaking about these two civilizations as two distant civilizations that are fundamentally opposed to one another. I think that Islam is to be celebrated both for its steadfastness in regards to its insistence upon its beliefs and its value system, its unchanging values, as well as its agility and ability to adapt to changing environments. And that's the genius of our system of fiqh, the genius of our jurisprudence, and that it allows for an understanding. And fundamentally, wherever we go, we approach our societies with the lens of benefit, not just the rights that are due upon us or that are due to us, but the rights that others have upon us, and how we function with our neighbors, how we function with our colleagues, and how we manifest that message of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace and blessings be upon him, to everything and everyone that's around us. And so I think that culturally speaking, yes, things will look different. They always have looked different, but that has enriched the collective Muslim tradition that we have today. Much of the benefit that came from Andalusian Muslims doesn't have the mark of Andalusia in a way that others cannot appreciate it and claim it as their own. And so the collective genius of what Muslims have produced, be it Persian Muslims or Muslims in Timbuktu or Turkish Muslims or Muslims in Andalus, is something that we all benefit from today. And so I do believe that British Muslims will have their mark, American Muslims will have their mark, French Muslims will have their mark, and that the unique ways in which Islam brings out the best of that cultural expression is one that we have yet to fully appreciate and look forward to in the future. Thank you.
Yes, to the member just there. Just third row back here, yeah. So, sorry, in the blue suit, yeah.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for your talk. It was really interesting. So we have a really well-established and active Islamic society here at Oxford. What advice would you give to Muslim brothers and sisters who read their 5 salahs, integrate into the Quran daily, but still feel unprepared for the day of Qiyamah? Thank you. Can
you repeat the last part of the question?
But still feel unprepared for the day of Qiyamah, so day of judgment.
That's a powerful question. Look, it's putting your best foot forward and depending on the mercy of God shapes our effort, right? Our individual efforts, our personal worship, our acts of piety towards the public. It's this idea that we have fear that we're never quite doing enough, but hope that He will accept us and have mercy on us regardless. And so that's what keeps you striving. And so the way that you are to function as a Muslim with the hereafter ahead of you, with this idea of a life that is beyond this one ahead of you, is in a way that you're not deflated in regards to your own personal tribulations and things that happen to you within this life, and to constantly be motivated and find incentive and reward in that which is beyond the material rewards and incentives for doing acts of good here in this material life. And so it's important for us to put that ahead of ourselves and to say that there's something greater than this world, and there is a greater pursuit and a greater reward than anything anyone of this world could give me, even if it means my acts of service towards them. And so putting that ahead of you, and obviously I've done a lot of work on the subject of the afterlife and on the subject of what is beyond this world. And I pray that we will all be sufficiently prepared, but that we never stop striving to be in the best position when that time comes for us.
Yes, to the member just here on the front row.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for your talk. My question's about the emotional paralysis that sometimes we feel when we sort of hear about things going on, especially in the Muslim world, and how to sort of stop that, how to actually do things that have tangible benefit as opposed to kind of just feeling really emotionally paralyzed and helpless at what they're going through.
Yeah, so analysis paralysis is a real thing. And when you have conflict after conflict, tragedy after tragedy flashing across your phone, it can really shut you off, and you can feel yourself unwilling or unmotivated to doing anything within your capacity. And so what we learn from our tradition is to solve the problems within your capacity. I share a personal story often that when I was visiting the Syrian refugee camps at the Jordan-Syria border, I remember the way that I felt when I was actually in the midst of that refugee camp and helping out refugees. And then suddenly, once you drive out at the end of the night, you realize that the refugee camp keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and you can question yourself and say, well, what was the point of working for that 100? What was the point of serving those people if I missed all of these people? And it kind of reminded me of the prophetic tradition of the Prophet, peace be upon him, when he mentions trying to grab people from the waist belt, right? He's trying to grab as many people as he can. And that's obviously in the capacity of salvation, but for me, it's just also in the capacity of just trying to help people. That sometimes you feel like you're trying to help as many people as you can, but you're only getting a few. What I would remind myself of is that God appreciates the little and the consistent, and you doing what's in your capacity, and that's what you're going to be asked about. And that you never know who you will help from the few that will go on to uplift their entire peoples. One of the most inspiring people that I met in the Syrian refugee camps was a young girl named Rahaf. I've spoken about her. She's 16 years old, and she had seen, well, she's not 16 anymore, but she had seen devastation that I could not even hear her speak of without being deeply disturbed, right, as a result of what she had seen. And she didn't want food. She wasn't interested in the handout. She was interested in going to school. She said, I want an education. I want an education. I want an education. You know, find me a way, get me a bus to the border of Jordan and Syria. And we, you know, basically the relief agency had said, well, can you get a group of Syrian refugees that also are just as motivated to go to school as you and that will be willing to make that long drive over to a school in Jordan every single day and forego the earnings of the day, because obviously, you know, you work in the farms, you do what you can to make the earnings for a day for you and your family. She was able to get her group of friends together, and we provided a school bus for her. And it's like an hour a day going and coming for her to go to school. And when I asked her why she wanted to go to school so much, she said that she wanted to become a lawyer, and she wanted to sue Bashar al-Assad for war crimes. I mean, in the ICC one day, for what he had done to her and her family. And I thought to myself, the inspiration, the resilience in that girl's eyes, that cannot be replicated on the outside. And so sometimes when you're helping a small group of people that are deeply impacted and affected by a tragedy, you may be inspiring in them and facilitating what could go on to uplift an entire people. So never stop solving the problems within your capacity, because that's what you're going to be asked about. And you don't know the blessing that will come out of those small efforts that may seem initially inconsequential.
I think we have time for one more question. The member just there, third in on the press bench.
Thank you. Salam alaikum, Sheikh, again. Thank you for your speech. Obviously, you were the founder of the Yaqeen Institute, which is an institute that a lot of us have benefited from in terms of knowledge and resources that you produce. I'd just like to hear insight about how you went about founding this, and maybe advice that you'd have for Muslims who are interested in recreating similar institutions in their communities, but who are obviously starting from scratch. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. You know, the Yaqeen Institute was founded in a climate, first and foremost, of intense Islamophobia, where there was sort of a recognition that you had all of these think tanks, Islamophobic think tanks, that were masquerading as honest evaluators of the Muslim world and Islam in the Middle East, that had completely overtaken all important and influential spaces where Islam is spoken about, dominated the internet, and put out false narratives about Islam that were now starting to penetrate deeply even the way Muslims felt about themselves. And so initially it was to respond to some of the issues that were arising in a hyper-Islamophobic environment on some of the most tense issues, and to put something out there, Muslim voices out there that spoke about these issues in a way that was intelligent, in a way that was academic, in a way that was authentic, in a way that could be referenced in university settings and important spaces, and that could bolster the Muslim identity and give Muslims the voice that they needed when they were in their spaces. And obviously what ends up happening is that the pandemic hits, and the shift, I think the global shift in what is affecting the way Muslims feel about themselves largely revolves around mental health and isolation and loneliness, and not feeling the spiritual wherewithal to continue to move forward. So while answering some of those difficult questions about Islam still remains a priority to bolster the Muslim identity, there's also an importance to helping young Muslims see their connection to faith in the midst of all sorts of tribulations and trials that exist today. And so we wanted to put out academic papers that are written by Islamic scholars and or academics, and then peer-reviewed, so that they're academically credible as well as Islamically credible, to have a proper peer review process in place, to have a proper editorial board, to produce content that could be referenced for generations to come, and then produce digestible forms of content from that content, media content, infographics, creative forms of content, and curricularize it to help young Muslims in particular grapple with these questions of faith. So this is where we are today, and this is why we study what causes doubt, what causes a crisis in belief for young Muslims, and help them find a journey towards their Islam to bolster that connection to faith. So, faith in the articles of faith, the pillars of Iman, as well as, their understanding their history and how they can channel the best of their history today. And then have a voice as well that speaks to non-Muslims that are looking for authentic resources on Islam, to also, help them find that journey of understanding Islam through a Muslim voice that hopefully is representative of the Muslim community and Orthodox Islam. Now, what I would advise Muslims, young Muslims that want to form institutions, never make the institutions about yourself. Make them a collective. It's better to have multiple voices involved in the beginning. So if you incorporate more people and you do a proper needs assessment as to what's needed in your society, what's needed in your community, and then try to have multiple voices working together, multiple people working together for that collective good, then do so. Stay sincere, constantly listen, consult as to how you could be better and grow. And do not ever see another good effort as a competitor. It destroys good work when the doers of good focus more on being the only doers of good in their space rather than helping one another get ahead. So, ta'awanu ala al-birri wa taqwa, work together in righteousness and in piety and in good works. So never become territorial, because that will chip away at your own mission and affect the ability to move forward as a community. Thank you.
I'm afraid that's all we have time for, but I think everyone can share in my conviction, and huge thanks to you, Amal, for coming tonight. And before we give you a very warm round of applause, I'd ask everyone that when myself and Amal are leaving to just stay seated, just so we can get out quickly. But without further ado, please could everyone join in appreciation for Professor Amal.